Welcome to Eternal Christendom. This is an apostolate that we've consecrated to Our Lady for the glory of our Lord, and my name is Joshua Charles. So the day has finally come when I'm doing what so many friends and family members and enemies and allies have asked me to do for many years, probably about a decade now, and that is start a podcast. And of course, this is not my podcast. It's all about me, Joshua Charles. It is belonging to our new apostolate, which is Eternal Christendom. So basically in every podcast, I want to tell you guys what the main goal is, so we know where we're all going, and I want to provide a roadmap for how we're going to get there so you guys can see all the points. I've just noticed that this is a very helpful way to communicate with people over the years. So what's the goal of today? The goal of today is a little bit of background on me, background on Eternal Christendom, and then what this podcast is all about, since, as you know, there aren't enough podcasts in the world. So, I've got to justify what we're doing here a little bit for all of you. So point number one, my background. Point number two, my conversion. Not going to go over the whole conversion story today. I will at some point. That would take a lot more time, though. Point number three is the background of Eternal Christendom and our story a bit. And point number four is this podcast itself, just wrapping up what we're going to do, what the formats are going to be, and whatnot. This podcast is what we're calling Masterpiece Number 1, Eternal Christendom. I'll explain it in a bit. But Eternal Christendom, we're focusing on creating 5 masterpieces, frankly, over the whole life of our organization. I'm 36 years old, so if I end up being 85 and Eternal Christendom still exists, which we're hoping for, these are the 5 masterpieces we're going to be working on the whole time. So the podcast is Masterpiece Number 1, but I'll explain all that in a little bit. I do want to note that today is a significant Sunday. It's the feast day of the Good Shepherd. It's basically the day on which we read from the Gospels the account where Jesus talks about him being the Good Shepherd. And so this comes from John 10, 11 through 16. And so I'll just read it just so we acknowledge this, because I think it is relevant to what we're trying to do at Eternal Christendom. Perhaps unlike some folks, we're going to be crystal clear on what our goal is. What's our goal? I want everybody to be Catholic. I think Jesus wants everybody to be Catholic too. I come from a Protestant background, but that's what we care about the most, that the truth, beauty, and goodness of the Catholic faith is adopted from everybody. I think it's the key to a meaningful life, and not just a meaningful life, but eternal life. And so let's read from John 10, 11 through 16. At that time, Jesus said to the Pharisees, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gave his life for his sheep, but the hireling, and he that is not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and flieth. And the wolf catcheth and scattereth the sheep. And the hireling flieth, because he is a hireling, and he has no care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know mine, and mine know me. As the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for my sheep. And other sheep I have that are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice. And there shall be one fold and one shepherd. So I think it's very fitting that we are publishing this first prologue, so to speak, for Eternal Christendom podcast on Good Shepherd Sunday, because ultimately what this apostolate's about, what this podcast is about, is the truth, beauty, and goodness of the Catholic faith, and the truth, beauty, and goodness of the civilization it created, Christendom. That civilization is not perfect. It's had many flaws because there are people in it. But what I discovered coming from a Protestant background, I came into the church in 2019. What I discovered is that Christ has in fact been the good shepherd to his people, and he has guided them through the teaching and the shepherding of the Catholic Church. Now, these will be for future episodes, but that doesn't exclude, as Jesus himself said, the possibility of hirelings. In fact, Jesus prophesied there would be hirelings. He prophesied there would be Judases. He prophesied there would be bad shepherds, frankly, evil shepherds, and the Catholic Church has had plenty of those. But it's also had a lot of good shepherds. And one of the things that shocked me so much when I was coming from Protestantism, just studying the history of it all, is that no matter how much evil and corruption there had been, the church's teaching had remained essentially the same over time. First century, second century, third century, fourth century, all the way to today. Again, essentially the same. The church's understanding has grown in many ways. But my point is that through the church, I discovered that Christ had in fact been a good shepherd, not only to Christians, but to all of humanity. And why? Because he wanted to provide a clear resounding, eternally true and valid gospel. And that is precisely why the church exists. And then the civilization it created. And so, but we'll go into that in a little bit. So the first point would be just a little bit about my background. So this is point number one. I don't think I'm all that interesting. If you want to find out all the details about me, well, at least some of them, you can go on our website, eternalchristendom.com. I have my personal website, joshuatcharles.com, but we're basically going to take everybody to Eternal Christendom's website. So you can get all the details there. But here's the extremely short version. I was born in 1988. I joke it's the saner half of the millennial generation. I'm now 36. Goes fast, people, so use it well. But from a very, very early age, as you can kind of see behind me, I think, I love to read. I was endlessly curious, which can be a vice, by the way, but we'll talk about that some other time. But I was endlessly curious. My mom frequently tells stories about before I could even read, I'd be 1.5, 2 years old, 3 years old. I would pick out a book, and I would open it, and I would start reading it. But, of course, I wouldn't be reading it because I was 2 years old. But I would be like, re-raw, 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 re. So I would fake reading it because I guess I just had a latent desire to want to read at that point. And my mom would offer to read it to me, and I would kind of get angry, like, no, leave me alone. And I would just continue to read. And so anyway, eventually my mom herself taught me to read. She's a teacher. And she homeschooled me for the first part of my life. And ironically enough, I had gone to public school a little bit before my mom homeschooled me. And I was actually behind a few grade levels in reading, which I'm sure is ironic to many people who know me. But then my mom homeschooled me, and I jumped forward a bunch of grade levels in reading. And so ever since then, I've loved to read. I've loved knowledge. And I remember, and being in my 30s now, I kind of see a potentially dark side to this. But I remember to this day, we had family down in Southern California that we would visit every year. And we'd be driving down, and I remember we were on I-5, Interstate 5 here in California. And I would see off in the distance, it was about dusk, so the sun was setting. I would see out in the distance this tree. And I remember, I don't know, I must have been 5 or 6, maybe a little bit older. I honestly don't remember. It all blends together now. But I saw this tree, and I had just learned the word photosynthesis. And like most little boys who learn big words, they all think they're brilliant then. But I remember looking at that tree and thinking of the process of photosynthesis because I saw these beautiful light rays coming from behind the tree, and it was around dusk, like I said. And I remember thinking, I remember to this day thinking, looking at that tree, I want to know everything. Now, I think there's a good side of that and there's a dark side of that. It makes me honestly think of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There are some things that humanity is not meant to know and meant to toy with. So there is a dark side to it. But my point is that from a very young age, I was just endlessly curious. I loved animals. I loved reading. I wanted to learn everything. And so it actually developed some mostly good habits, but also some bad habits. One of the bad habits was my mom would say, all right, it's bedtime. And instead of going to bed, I would wait till she and my dad had tucked me in. They would go off, and I would wait, and then I would make sure I had a towel with me, and I would put a towel at the bottom of the door to prevent any light from going out. Then I would turn on the light, and I would keep reading. So I'm still recovering from some of the sleep habits that induced in me back then. But anyway, that was how much I loved to read. Obviously, shouldn't have been dishonest with my parents, but that shows you the kind of little boy I was, and many fundamental aspects of that have continued to be the case. And then about when I was 11 or 12, I got into music. Before that, I think I was heading more in the athletic direction. I played Little League, and but then we have some musicians in our family, and I seemed to have a natural gift for it. I was figuring out some pieces of Mozart by ear before I even had my first piano lesson. I watched the movie, maybe some of you have seen it, Amadeus, which is a kind of I guess you could call biopic of sorts, a dramatic biopic of Mozart. There's a lot of historical inaccuracies, but it's a fun movie. It's a dramatic movie. It's a sad movie. But it inspired me a lot with the figure of Mozart, and I just found that when I started putting my hands to the keyboard, I just had a natural gifting for it. And so my parents got me lessons, I think, again, about 11 or 12. And so I started playing, and it went really well. But at the time, I just had a little dinky Casio keyboard, and so my parents wanted to get me better. We were very middle class, low middle class sometimes at that time. But before they wanted to get me the next best thing, they wanted to make sure I was committed to the little keyboard we had. So they gave me about a few months on that very dinky Casio one, and I was clearly very committed. So then the next level up was a kind of a full scale, all 88 keys Yamaha keyboard that was weighted, so it was like the weight of the keys was similar to a grand piano. And so that was my graduation. So that I was on that for about 3 years, and they wanted to make sure I was committed to that one before we went to a full grand piano, which is in my house to this day. So, but on my 15th birthday, my youth pastor, conniving with my parents, picked me up at the house and said, "Hey, let's go out to In-N-Out or something." I forget where we went. In-N-Out, best burger in the world. In case I'm settling that debate, the Five Guys In-N-Out debate, whatnot, Whataburger. But we went to In-N-Out, and I come back, and in my living room is this gorgeous full Yamaha grand piano. And my parents were there, some family were there, some friends. And so ever since I was 15, I had this beautiful grand piano, thanks to the sacrifice of family members. Grandparents helped purchase it as well. And so anyway, I've been always thankful for that. But I always loved how my parents did it. They basically said, you need to master something small before we give you something bigger to master. And at this point, I want to point out one thing. Both my parents were extremely loving, extremely supportive. I want to give one important piece of credit to my father in particular. I wish I had the letter in front of me. I should have brought that with me. But when I was 5, he wrote me a letter. So this would have been 1993. He got me the book, "Oh, the Places You'll Go," a Dr. Seuss book. And maybe some of you are familiar with that book. And he wrote a letter to me in an inscription at the beginning of it that I certainly don't claim that I fully understood the importance of it when I was 5, but I've certainly understood the importance of it as I've gotten older. And essentially what he said in that letter is, "Son, I really love you. I believe God has great plans for your life, and that you can be great." And he said, "But the choice is yours, whether you will be great or be mediocre." And he said, "I believe with all my heart that you will choose greatness." He said, "But the choice is yours." And so that was kind of the way I was raised with both my parents. My mom communicated this more through her wonderful example. And my dad did it. He just constantly inculcated it in me as I was growing up. He basically said, "Son, you can do whatever you want, whatever you dream about, and I will support you. But the condition for my support and your mom's is that you go after it with everything. There's no, well, we'll keep it PG. Well, there's no half doing it." And so that was what I was raised with. And so when it came to reading or music or school or just the general pursuit of truth, that was the mentality I had, that there's really nothing that's worth putting only half of your heart into it. You've got to put your whole heart into it. And frankly, I think that lesson, that childhood inculcation made everything that has been good in my life possible, and for which I'm eternally grateful to both my mom and my dad. So Mom and Dad, if you're watching this, thank you. None of it would be possible without you. I own all the mistakes. All the mistakes are mine, but to the extent there's anything good in my life, and anything good that I can share with others, which we're hoping certainly to do through Eternal Christendom, that I owe that very much to you guys. So thank you very much, even becoming Catholic. So anyway, as I'm young, one of the things I really got into was original sources. And one of these was especially the Founding Fathers. Some of you can go back and see in my bio, I wrote a number of books about the Founding Fathers. I won't go into the details now, but one of them ended up being a crazy opportunity with Glenn Beck, who used to be on Fox News and whatnot. He's a commentator these days. And it did really well. And that just opened all sorts of doors for me. I can tell the story about that some other time. But I really grew to love original sources. As a Protestant, I love the Bible, so I was constantly reading the Bible. from a young age, I had a discipler. So around 6th grade or so, this is when it started. And my discipler, he was just a trusted friend, mentor. I think he was, ironically, as old as I am now, in his 30s. And so we would read books like Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology. And Wayne Grudem is a Reformed theologian, I think. And, it just went through every bit of doctrine, the Bible verses for it, the explanation of it, whatnot. So I don't claim that in 6th grade I understood everything, but that was how seriously we were going into it. I had some family members, my dad, an uncle of mine, who I'd be studying parts of the Bible, and I'd constantly be on the phone talking with them like, well, what about this? What about that? So anyways, just insatiably curious, and was really getting into original sources. And so, but then I read a book that an uncle actually recommended to me, and it was called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. Now, it was published in 1985, and that was significant because in his introduction, which I'm about to quote from, he was reflecting on the fact that the world had passed through the year 1984 and was so far not in an Orwellian, dystopian, tyrannical nightmare, at least so far. And of course, it was named, that's significant because he was referring to the British author, George Orwell, his book, 1984, which, as I said, was basically this dystopian nightmare vision of the future in which a completely tyrannical government controlled everything. But there was another book that was written, I believe, in the 40s by another British author named Aldous Huxley. And Aldous Huxley presented a similarly dystopian view of the future, but his view basically was less Big Brother smashing on your face with a boot forever, which is how Orwell described what was happening to him. But another one where basically people were driven by pleasure all the time, and basically their powers of perception and their intellects and all that had been completely dulled by hedonism and drugs and things of that sort. So again, the name was by Neil Postman. He was a professor at NYU, I believe. It was called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And so my uncle highly recommended I read this. And I won't go into the whole book today, but I want to read one quote from the introduction that really gets at it, because it's very significant for what we're doing, not only with my own life, but with Eternal Christendom. So here's the quote. It's from the introduction for anybody who maybe has the book and they want to read it. Here's what he said. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny, quote, failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions, unquote. In 1984, Orwell added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we fear will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. This book is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right. So I'm sure when I read that, some of you are thinking, oh my goodness, that's extremely relevant. And you're right. I read that, I believe, when I was 18 or 19. And it had a profound impact on me to the extent that when people would ask, what kind of book do you recommend reading? I said, well, when it comes to our culture and where we are, other than the Bible itself, you need to read Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's an amazing book. And basically the case that he makes is that electronic media, which he takes back to the telegraph, so the 1800s, but particularly since the age of television began in the 50s or so. And he was basically making the case that electronic media was dumbing us down. And he traced this phenomena in religion, in politics, and in education. And so I think he makes a good case. And in a way, I would kind of lightheartedly say, if you want proof of his case, just look outside, go on social media, whatnot. One thing I've pointed out when it comes to politics, if people really want to see an example of this, because he himself points to this, is the degradation of presidential debates. If you look at, maybe take 30 seconds or so of the JFK-Nixon debates, I think there were several, just pick 30 seconds. You'll see civility. You'll see coherent grammar. you will see both of the men actually complimenting each other and giving credit where they can, because they were actually friends. They weren't like super close friends, but Nixon and Kennedy were friends, and you could tell that they were not going for low blows. They were having honest disagreements, and it was pretty darn substantive. But already there was an example of kind of what Postman was talking about when they took polls about who won the debate. Those who heard it on the radio thought Nixon won the debate, whereas those who saw it on television thought JFK won the debate. So this was sort of the beginning of what the phenomenon that Postman was pointing out, that when we introduced this new medium of television and whatnot, it was fundamentally changing how people were receiving the information and how they were processing it. And so, because clearly, if the division it wasn't so much between if you were for Nixon or for Kennedy, it was between the medium by which you were hearing them. And so, and of course, visually, I think JFK was kind of famously handsome. And so people who saw him thought, they had a more positive feeling toward JFK. Whereas Nixon was apparently, he had just gotten over some sickness. He was kind of sweating and kind of looked a bit ashen and whatnot. And so, but of course, nobody on the radio could see that. They could only hear. And so for those who could only hear, they apparently thought Nixon won. So anyway, this is kind of an example of what Postman was pointing out, that the nature of the mediums we use, it doesn't just change how the message is put out. It affects how it's received by those to whom it's directed. And that was a very, very powerful lesson for me. I grew up in high school where we didn't have smartphones until my freshman year of college, which was in 2006, 2007. And frankly, I'm more and more thankful for that as we go forward. I don't want to get bogged down in this subject, but essentially I think Postman is right. And one thing he points back to, there's a famous set of debates in the 1800s by Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, I believe was his name. He was a senator, and he and Lincoln were vying for the presidency, and they were debating the issue of slavery. But I mention it because Postman mentions it at the beginning of his book. When people showed up for the Lincoln-Douglas debates, they showed up for 4 to 7 hours, and there'd be, an intermission for supper or something in the middle. Could you even imagine people showing up for 4 to 7 hours for a political debate these days? I mean, it's unimaginable. Now, I will say that I do think with long-form discussion, which we're hoping to do on this podcast with interviews and whatnot, I do think that's making a comeback for a variety of reasons. I think people just realize the modern world is not very deep. It's not very substantive. And so there's this longing and thirst for deeper, more honest conversation. So I do think it's making a comeback. But this was a point that Postman was making, that when when the medium turned electronic, that fundamentally shifted us away from the written word and made us far more visual, far more, he even talks about short attention spans, that our attention spans just got way, way less. Even think about something like Google. Now, I think Google is very helpful in many ways, but the ability of many people in olden days, so to speak, to remember things would have been much, much higher. Whereas once there's Google, there's so much less that you have to remember, because we've got these smartphones and these devices. We're usually connected to the internet at all times of the day. We just Google search something. So why commit something to memory if I can just Google search it? So these are just examples of what Postman was talking about. So not going to fully explicate Postman, but it's a crucial point to understand for how my life went and some of the lessons I've had, but then what we're doing with Eternal Christendom. And so anyway, I will move up to my conversion here. So I'm doing a ton of work with the Founding Fathers. And one of the things I was doing with the Founding Fathers, as I said before, was reading the original sources. After this book with Glenn Beck happened, I had an amazing opportunity to literally spend 4 or 5 years just reading the Founding Fathers, reading their diary entries, reading their essays, reading their books, a lot of things that many people aren't even aware is out there. And I noticed something. I was learning a lot from the founders and finding a lot of wisdom that I had no idea was there. Many people are familiar with the Declaration of Independence, obviously the Constitution. Many people are probably aware, fewer have read the Federalist Papers, which were written in support of the Constitution. But other than that, even a well-read American probably won't know very much about the actual detailed writings of the Founding Fathers. And so I was discovering all this wisdom, all these nuggets. You'd have these amazing letters where, they're discussing personal details like the rest of us would if we're writing a letter, or our text, hey, honey, can you get this at the grocery store or whatever? Of course, they're doing it through a letter. But then there'd be these wonderful gems, these pieces of gold or gems that they'd be like, wow, I need to share that. So I would post these quotes all the time. But you wouldn't have found these quotes unless you were actually digging in the sources and reading them. And so my love of original sources was only growing and growing and growing. And one thing it started doing was, I grew up in a very conservative home. I'm still politically very conservative, actual conservative, not liberal conservative, which is what so many are today, but that'd be for another podcast. I joke when people say, what kind of conservative are you? I joke medieval. So we'll explain that in future podcasts. But one thing I realized from the founders, many in the conservative side, I grew up in a Reaganite kind of home. I think Ronald Reagan did some really good things and some not so good things. But one of the things you'll have in a conservative home is a lot of veneration for America's founding fathers. But what I was discovering when I was actually reading the founding fathers was that they had a lot of lessons that I wasn't learning in the conservative movement. I'll give, I can do one example. Let's do one example. One example would be many of the founding fathers were a bit skeptical and worried about America being too prosperous, America being too rich. That sounds kind of shocking because most people today, it's the economy, stupid, right? Everything's about the economy, growth. And of course, there's some truth to that. But I didn't expect to find this in the founding fathers, because we usually thought of the founding fathers as, purely free market, supporting property rights and freedom of contract and things like that. And they certainly did have a lot of that. But there was also this side where you'll see it in Washington, you'll see it in Franklin, you'll see it in Adams, you'll see it even in Hamilton, you'll see it in Jefferson. They expressed this fear that excessive prosperity will lead to the vice of luxury. And the vice of luxury was essentially you get too comfortable, and then your virtue kind of slips into vice because you're more interested in maintaining that comfort than in maintaining the liberty that allowed you to earn that comfort in the first place. You get the point? They would point to many ancient examples of this, whether the Roman Empire or Greece or whatnot. There are many ancient historians that point this out about the Roman Empire, that the Roman Empire kind of lost its early virtue that allowed it to gain an empire in the first place. This virtue, was associated with Roman poverty. By poverty, we don't mean that they're barely able to feed themselves, but just, simplicity. They have what they need and not much more. But in that state of simplicity, they had virtues of frugality and self-sacrifice and duty. But then once they conquered this empire and all these riches came in from the east, this is something that historians like Polybius and Livy point out. Polybius was a Greek Roman citizen, I believe, writing a few centuries before Christ. And then Livy wrote in the first century. He was a Roman. And so they both point this out, and many other ancients do as well, that the Roman Republic began to decay when the society became luxurious. The people became more interested in things and materialism, and they lost their original virtue. So many of the founding fathers were very worried about this. And that warning would not have been something that I would have learned as a political conservative, American conservative, because everything was about, well, how could you want anything else other than a growing economy and constant growth and consumer? What are consumers doing? That horrible term for human beings. So anyway, that could be a whole other conversation. But the point is that was a very powerful example. Another one, this is why John Adams ended up being intellectually my favorite founding father. John Adams was very sober about American prospects. There's a letter he wrote to a man named John Taylor. I think it was about 1810 or so. And he said something to the effect of, we make ourselves popular, Mr. Taylor, when we say that we're the best, essentially. I don't have the quote in front of me. But when we say we're the best and we're not like other men, referring to America. And he said, but at the end of the day, that's nothing but pride and the self-conceit of the Pharisee. He says, thank God I'm not like other men, that sort of thing. And so Adams was very sober about whether the American experiment would work or not. And in fact, there are letters from his retirement where he basically said, what we instituted has already been lost. And there are other founding fathers who say the same thing. Now, why do I mention that? Well, that was another lesson because there was this idea in American conservative circles of American exceptionalism. again, that could be a whole other podcast, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. But essentially, many times this view of American exceptionalism would have no sobriety about the American experiment, its prospects, and it would kind of excessively praise the United States in a way that I think made us very blind to the reality that we are still human beings, we're still fallen, and I know a lot of conservatives they did believe that, but they would still act as if the United States is in a totally separate ontological category, and that was just something I was not seeing in virtually any of the founding fathers. They were much more sober. So anyway, those were two lessons: luxury and American exceptionalism. And this was all before, I'm still a Protestant during this time. So then I go to law school in 2014. I studied piano performance for my undergrad, did a master's in government, and then in 2014 I head off to law school. And this is where I'll point out where things started to shift, and this is where I'll go a little bit into my conversion. There's too much to go into right now. But I went to law school, and there was a great dean there. I still call him, he's not the dean of the law school anymore, but I still call him dean because of it. And he was raised Catholic, and I think he may be coming back. Be praying for him. But he told me at the time, he said, because he knew my background with the founding fathers and reading them, and he said, well, if you do with the church fathers what you do with the founding fathers, you'll probably end up Catholic. And I just thought to myself, all right, weirdo. I didn't even know who the church fathers were at that point, which I'm embarrassed to say. Like many evangelicals and Protestants in general, I knew very little about church history. And so I think I asked him who they were, and the ancient Christian leaders, whatever. So I was like, oh, okay, whatever. And I had zero interest in anything Catholic. But the short version, the reason I mentioned that little prophecy he made is because he ended up being right. When I actually dug into the church fathers, that was the ultimate turning point for my own conversion. And so I'll give the extremely short version of that right now. I've done interviews with several other podcasts. I'll be doing a more complete version on this podcast about my conversion. But here's the extremely short version. I began reading the church fathers 3 years after my law school dean made that prophecy in 2017. Prior to 2017, I had been feeling increasing tension about Protestantism. And I wasn't conceiving of it as the time as a Protestant or Catholic thing. I was just thinking this Christianity thing is making less sense within the framework I have. I wasn't thinking of leaving Jesus. I never lost my personal trust in Jesus. But I was losing trust in the basic framework I have. And I had been, just so people know, I had been at many different types of congregations. I'd been in Methodist ones, Baptist ones, Reformed ones. I think the one we didn't get to was Anglican. And I'm sure many Anglican friends will be like, well, see, that's why, we'll talk about Anglicanism in the future, I assure you. But I went to many different kinds, and there were just so many things about Protestant doctrines that weren't clicking. I love the Bible from a very early age, and there were just a lot of things that weren't clicking. Now, Protestantism is not a single thing. Protestantism is a bunch of shards of something. I would say the Catholic faith. And it splits in a million directions, and there are different Protestant stances on basically every issue under the sun. So I'll just speak very generally. Again, I'll do my whole conversion on some other podcast. But for today's purpose, I'll simply say things like sola scriptura, scripture alone, things like once saved, always saved, or the more Calvinist version of it, perseverance of the saints. The idea that you can't lose your salvation. Whether there's Christian divorce, all sorts of different moral issues. These were things that I grew up with Protestants differing about. Things as fundamental as baptism. Things as fundamental as, like what I just said, can you lose your salvation? I mean, if we can lose our salvation, that's going to affect how we live. How could it not? If you know that it's possible for a choice of your free will to cause you to forfeit an eternal life with God, how could that not affect how you live? So these were fundamental issues. And essentially, I kept running into a problem. And again, I'll go into more details in another podcast. I kept running into a problem. I had a lot of mentors in my life. I still do. Had them since I was a teenager. By the way, it's a game-changing thing. So if you don't have mentors in your life, I don't care how old you are, even if you're 40 or 50 or 60, get mentors. It has completely and utterly changed my life. Get them. So, but what would happen is I'd have these wonderful godly mentors, and sometimes they weren't even mentors. Some were just people I loved and respected, like men like John MacArthur or John Piper or R.C. Sproul. These are just some modern Protestant figures. R.C. Sproul died a few years ago. Piper and MacArthur are still around. But these were just guys I respected. So when I was working through some sort of doctrinal issue, they were the ones I would go to. And then also my mentors in person. So mentors and these respected Protestant figures, I'd basically be in this conundrum of they're taking all sorts of different stances on different doctrinal issues. And I just wanted to love Jesus. And Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. I wanted to love Jesus. That meant, according to Jesus, I would have to obey his commandments. But then the question arises, well, what are those commandments? Well, then it's like, well, go to Scripture. Well, but then it looks like there's some things in Scripture that are not totally crystal clear, even if you're good faith and you're trying your best. And so, well, then I'll consult various wise men, wise and good men. And it turns out that didn't solve the problem either, because I had wise, virtuous, good faith Bob and wise, virtuous, good faith John, and, multiply that accordingly per whatever issue. And they couldn't agree. There was no way to umpire their doctrinal stance. So I ended up being in a situation where Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. I wanted to know what those commandments were, but I couldn't find out what they were. And there was no way to get final resolution. And so for a variety of reasons, this struck me as very absurd. And again, I'll go into the details some other podcast. But that was happening in the 10 years leading up to when I first began to read the Church Fathers in 2017. I had actually concluded by that point that Sola Scriptura didn't make any sense. I was reading a lot of Protestant sources that were explaining it, and it wasn't making sense for many, many reasons. Again, that'll be a whole other podcast. But all of that was preceding reading the Church Fathers. And by the time I began reading the Church Fathers, I had already grown increasingly frustrated. I trusted that Jesus would take me to where I needed to be, but I couldn't resolve many of these issues. I couldn't make sense of them from Scripture, and I couldn't make sense of them as far as if I want to love Jesus, I got to obey his commandments, and I can't even know with certainty what those commandments are. So that was the prequel to reading the Church Fathers. And then I graduated law school in May of 2017, and I went to law school in Virginia, and a great law school, Regent University. It's an evangelical law school. And I had seen for many years this big 38-volume set of the Church Fathers. Again, I didn't know who the Church Fathers were, but I would always see this 38-volume set when I'd go to buy other theology books. And being a bibliophile, it could be about botany. I'd be like, I want it if I see a multi-volume set of books. Actually, it's these books right behind me. These are the 38 that I got. So anyway, I moved back to California, and I'm thinking, these last 3 years have been kind of difficult. I will treat myself. I will reward myself with buying this massive 38-volume set. I think it was about $1,200 or $1,500 at the time. I think it's well past $2,000 now, so I lucked out. Although you can get all the text for these on a site called CCEL. I think it's Classic Christian Ethereal Library, or New Advent. You can get the text for all these books. So you can get it for free. I didn't realize it at the time, but even if I did, I like physical books. So anyway, why did I get that? Well, to reward myself, but also because I was working at the Museum of the Bible at the time. And ironically, and it's a great organization. They have a museum in D.C., very, very top-notch. I had been hired basically to do their grand opening Bible, which was it was called the Global Impact Bible. And it was an idea I put to them, and they really liked it, and we did it. Basically, it's a Bible that on every page, every other page or so, there's a picture or a quote or a story about how the Bible has impacted politics or education or art or music or whatever it may be, so that people have a sense when they're reading the Bible itself just how amazingly impactful on their world it's been. I mean, things like idioms they would use, or things like how verses from different books of Scripture would be inscribed on congressional buildings, or all sorts of things. So it was an amazing project. And like with many books, especially big books, we had a lag time between when we were done with the manuscript and when it'd be printed and all that. So we finished it, I think, about May or so, and they'd be printing it. And the building was opening in DC in November of 2017. So my boss literally told me, Josh, research whatever you want, and we will make it into exhibits in the future after the building is open. So literally no better scenario for someone like me who loves to read and loves to dig into the truth. Now, one thing I forgot that I'll mention here. In college, after the success of that first book with Glenn Beck, another crazy story I'll tell some other time. But after that success, I was praying to God because I'd actually transitioned out of music, which was it was very tough because I was very devoted to my teacher, had an amazing teacher. We're still very close to this day. Loved music, still love music, but I felt I had more things to do. Like God had given me more to do. And so I told my teacher, he was very supportive. But then that crazy book project happened, and I'll tell you the story some other time, but it was very interesting because I prayed to God at that time, God, if there is some way I can just always keep reading and digging for the truth, and sharing it with people, and if that could somehow pay my bills, that'd be great. And the short version is God has obliged me with that, and I feel extremely humbled and very blessed. And as he's freely given to me, I'm hoping to freely give to as many of you as possible. So I say that because I'm told by my boss at the Museum of the Bible, research whatever you want. We'll make it into exhibits later. There's nothing better for someone like me. So I start reading the Church Fathers. I'm not looking for the Catholic faith. I'm not looking for the Catholic faith at all. I was confused about how I would resolve these various theological issues I had, but I was not looking for the Catholic faith whatsoever. I still had this sort of background prejudice of, well, we left those guys a long time ago and good riddance. They're quasi-pagan, probably apostate. I just had kind of vague ideas about it at that point. So anyway, I start reading the Church Fathers, and lo and behold, from the very earliest Church Fathers, the Apostolic Fathers, guys who either knew or were within one generation of the apostles themselves, within 60, 70 years, in some cases, or less, of Jesus Christ rising from the dead and ascending into heaven, they were saying extremely Catholic things. And that blew my mind. And it's funny because I've had a number of Protestant friends and colleagues who've said, well, you're just reading it with Catholic lenses. It's like, I didn't have any Catholic lenses when I started reading these guys. I couldn't stand the Catholic Church. I couldn't stand the papacy. I had zero interest in it. But it screams out to you from the page. And in particular, St. Ignatius of Antioch, who is my confirmation saint, he's talking about the Eucharist and the authority of bishops and the priesthood and the unity of the church and the danger of heresy and the authority of bishops to teach, and just amazing, amazing stuff. That Christian worship is the sacrifice of the Eucharist, which is Catholic teaching to this day. He even compared the Eucharist to the very body and blood of Christ that had died and risen again. He wasn't interpreting the Eucharist symbolically or even spiritually. He was saying the Eucharist is the very body and blood of Christ that was shed and rose again. And he was contrasting this with some heretics at the time who didn't believe that. So I was reading that, I was like, oh my goodness, a disciple of the apostles would consider me a heretic. And so anyway, there's a whole lot of details to that, but I essentially made reading the Church Fathers my full-time job. I'm not joking. It was a 9 to 12 hour a day endeavor. And because I was so shocked by reading some of these initial guys, St. Clement of Rome, St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Justin Martyr, I was like, I need to get to the bottom of this. And so eventually I started reading some more apologetics books. I even bought more Protestant apologetics books because I did not want to become Catholic. Did not want to become Catholic. It was the last thing I wanted to do. In fact, when I realized I'd have to become Catholic, I got kind of depressed, quite honestly. So that's the extremely short version. I'll go into more details at some point. But let's just say that becoming Catholic brought many, many threads together in my life. Not only in my thinking, but vocation and just the grand picture with which I view the world. And that's kind of where we get to Eternal Christendom and what we're all about. I'm going to be reading a lot from our website at first just to explain what our vision and what our mission is. But as a preliminary comment, I just want to say, I think we all know that we're in a very dark period I've often joked that, especially since COVID, everything, instead of BC AD, it seems to be BC and AC, before COVID and after COVID. We're in a dark, confusing time, both in the world and in the church, frankly. And so there are many things to complain about. There are many things to be worried about. There are many things that we justifiably are concerned about. And there are frankly many people out there who are already commenting on all of these things. Now, I'll go back to one of the earlier books I did, Liberty Secrets, The Lost Wisdom of America's Founders. In the introduction to that book, I made a point, this was after 4 or 5 years of reading the Founding Fathers and their writings, just digging into it. I made the point that I thought what was going on in a lot of the political space was many people were essentially just repeating the same talking points over and over again with their own particular branding, but they weren't digging deep into the roots of things. And that what was really needed if we were going to recover our society, if we were going to make a comeback, I was thinking particularly the United States, we needed to dig deep, because the whole modern world is overtaken by superficiality in so many ways. And what I was finding was this immense treasure in the writings of the Founding Fathers, stuff that I wasn't aware of up to that point. And so I said at that time, this would have been in 2015, the call of the hour is we need to dig deep, even when it's behind closed doors and it doesn't get us, acclaim and applause, accolades. Because if we're not going to dig deep, we won't be able to put down deep roots. And if we're not putting down deep roots, we are not going to create a civilization or recover a civilization that we can be proud of and that we can pass on to future generations. So when it comes to the crisis in the world and in the church, the vision of Eternal Christendom, we want something hopeful. We want something that is constructive. I won't say we want something positive. That's a lot of lingo you'll hear these days. I guess I could in a sense, but the reason I don't say that is because there's a lot of bad things we need to talk about too. A lot of very dark lessons from history to apply to some very dark realities right now. So not everything will be positive. We're going to talk about real things. I'm going to try and be as authentic with you as I possibly can. I do have my private life and I have my public life. But a motto I had in college was from Cicero. And the motto is esse quam videri. And it means to be rather than to appear. And so I'm a big believer in that, in authenticity. And so you're going to get as close to the real me as I possibly can. And I try to make it be esse quam videri, to be rather than to appear. So what you see is what you get. And by the way, I don't assume that I'm always right. If you talk with my team or a lot of my friends, I do have strong opinions about some things, usually because I've thought about it a lot and whatnot. But I thrive on that constructive feedback as well. So that's what Eternal Christendom is. It's the fruit of a lot of that, this constructive thought and feedback and whatnot. And so we want something hopeful and unifying. So unifying within the church. So I'll give one example of this. I attend a traditional Latin Mass parish. I prefer the Latin Mass, just being frank. But I frequently also go to a daily Novus Ordo Mass because it's much closer to where I live. And so, the liturgical wars are a big thing going on in the church right now. Eternal Christendom is not going to be about that kind of stuff. There will be times when I will mention aspects of the traditional liturgy that I think are worth maintaining. But this is not a news commentary endeavor. It's not a ecclesial politics endeavor, okay? This is a Christendom endeavor. And when we call it Eternal Christendom, that word eternal is particularly important because as much as possible, we want this apostolate to be about the things that endure. The things that were true yesterday, they're true today, and they're going to be true for the thousands or millions of years left of history, or maybe the few years left of history. Who knows these days? But in any event, you get the point, that it is what is eternally true, the eternal verities, so to speak. And so we have a great tradition and heritage. The Catholic faith built Western, a large chunk of Eastern civilization as well. It's not just Western, but it built Christendom. And Christendom, you can hear kind of a play off of another word, kingdom. What is a kingdom? A kingdom is a society ruled by a king. So what is Christendom? Christendom is a society, a civilization, ruled by a particular king, namely Christ, hence Christendom. Not Christendom, that sometimes people mispronounce it. Christendom, okay? So there is so much that we need to recover. Again, nobody taught me these sorts of things. I had to go out there and kind of learn it for myself by reading all this stuff, and I'm still reading it all. And there's been so many cool things that I found and that many others are finding. I feel like there's a lot of people trying to hit, ironically, it's a CIA term, ground truth. They're trying to dig deep to ground truth. As a friend of mine recently joked, he's a Catholic convert as well. He said, we keep digging until we hit rock, referring to Peter and the papacy, of course. So we want to do something constructive and hopeful on that. Again, I won't say positive, because positive can be a bit, namby-pamby and kind of pie in the sky. There's a lot of things to be very concerned about right now. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But in the midst of that, I want to do something. Our team wants to do something. And we want to ask you as patrons, potential patrons, we want to have you join us to help build something that will last, that will endure. But to do that, it needs to have a long-term vision and a deeper understanding of what's going on. So with that, I wanted to basically share how we understand the crisis we're in the middle of, and basically, essentially, what we're planning to do. Now, a lot of details are going to be coming out. Frankly, we're figuring out a lot of details. But I think you'll get the vision. And we already explained it in a video that we shared about a month ago that was done by Evan Amato at Rewire the West. He's become a great friend. Evan did a great job kind of explaining. It's our first video called Welcome to Eternal Christendom. And it lays out our vision in about 8.5 minutes. But I wanted to basically read some text from our website that explains it in a bit more detail in a way that the video didn't have time to go into. So here's what I first want to share is basically our civilizational crisis, how we understand what's going on. And here's what we say. We are in the midst of a civilizational crisis, perhaps the worst in the history of Christendom. But this time, we are not faced with plagues or wars that threaten our bodies. We are in danger instead of losing the soul of our civilization. The crisis is threefold. It is within the church, within the world, and the mode by which we pass down the great tradition. And I'll explain all that in more detail in just a bit. First, in the church, multiple generations of poor catechesis and faithlessness has led to pervasive ignorance of, indifference toward, and sometimes outright rejection of the great tradition among Catholics. Second, in the world, the great tradition has virtually disappeared from the vast majority of modern education programs. Niche options are available to those who can afford it, which, as we all know, is fewer and fewer people these days. But multiple generations have now been systematically robbed of their heritage. I'll pause here. I'm sure those of us who went to public school, you're not going to find this stuff. Are you going to learn about Christendom? No. We barely even learn about our own country, the United States, let alone the Christian civilization that kind of spawned everything. Okay, going forward. Third and finally, the great tradition is often contained in books that remain as they have for millennia, bare text on a page. They lack beauty and often fail to explain and provide context for their content, leaving uninformed modern readers in the dark. But in a time when formerly Christian societies have gone through a media revolution, bare text with no explanations, no context, and no beauty is no longer captivating to a culture that has become irreversibly digital, electronic, and visual. So at this point, I want to remind you of the Neil Postman quote I had a while ago about from amusing ourselves to death. So we're in an irreversibly digital, visual, and electronic generation. So I want to give a few examples of this. So during my time in the White House, I was there in 2020 and the early part of 2021. I was a speechwriter there. One of the things I would do is I'd come home from work, and I usually didn't have a ton of time left. You would have long days, especially in the middle of a campaign and COVID. But what I would often do is I would read ancient Roman and Greek historians. And so among those I read were Polybius and Sallust and a few others. So anyway, this is an example of Polybius, the histories. This is Oxford Classics, okay? But look, does any of that look interesting? No. And for a modern reader who knows nothing about history, who knows nothing about Western civilization, who knows nothing about the Greeks, this is not helpful. This is not helpful. There's going to be a ton of things in here that they don't understand any of the background. I'll give an example. With the Federalist Papers, the great articles that were written by some of the founding fathers to support the ratification of the Constitution, I have looked for multiple versions, and there's virtually no version that will explain what the reader's reading. So, for example, the Federalist Papers mention events, people, battles, empires, etc., that the modern reader will simply have no clue about, the vast majority of them. So unless you explain what the heck they're reading, they're not going to have a clue what is happening, okay? So this is unfortunately what has happened to the works of the great tradition. I think you can already tell where I'm going with this great tradition, but I'm going to go into a bit more detail about that in a second. But this is Polybius' history. This is a great work of history about Rome. Many of our founding fathers read this. Many of the great fathers were familiar with this work. But for a digital and visual generation, a generation on this stuff, okay, on these things, this is not sufficient. We're forgetting essentially beauty in the midst of this. I'll get to that in a second, but that's one example. I'll give another example. This is Augustine's City of God, a very famous work. But again, let's see if I can hold this up here. Same thing. There's nothing beautiful. There's virtually no explanations. There's no pictures. There's no charts that explain some of the concepts that St. Augustine's talking about, some of the connections he's making. This is one of the greatest books in all of history. But for a modern, hyper-visual, hyper-digital, and who's not familiar with our history and our heritage, this is not helpful. And I've looked for many different versions of City of God, and they're basically all like this. Let me give another example. Bede, Ecclesiastical History of the English People. This is a Penguin classic, and Bede is a great church father, as you could probably guess, from England. And so a great work, but again, if you open it up, you'll see a lot of underlining from me, but that's it. There's no background, no explanations, nothing beautiful. There's nothing that a highly visual, digital, electronically oriented 21st century person will find attractive about this. Nothing. And it mentions a million different events and people. They have no clue what it's talking about. So it's not attractive. Finally, here's another one. I use this example. This is Barnes & Noble Classics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay. Now I use this. Why? Because this actually is a beautiful cover, right? You see these pictures here. It's shiny. Okay. All that's good. It's got the gold, kind of the gold shiny thing that some Bibles have. Okay. That's nice. But then it's just text on a page. It's just text on a page. There's no explanations. The figures that are mentioned, the events, the Greek historical background, cultural background, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. And unfortunately, this is the state that many of the books of the great tradition are in. I'll give one more example. This would be, I just picked a random volume of the Church Fathers. This is from that 38 volume set I mentioned. When you open it, those are all my dog ears, if you can say. I dog ear when there are things that are really Catholic, and I'm going to go back and archive later for articles and stuff. So, we're trying to be very, very comprehensive in this. But when you open it, again, just text. Just text. There's some footnotes, but they're highly academic. They don't really explain a whole lot many times. Okay? So that's the predicament we're in. That's the state a lot of these classics are in. And these are the classics that created statesmen and saints and all that. I'll get into that in a second. But that's the state they're in. We've got a highly visual, digital, electronic generation of people. That's just where people are. This is maybe good enough for nerds like me. Maybe you're a nerd. Maybe this we want to learn this stuff, so we're going to read it anyway. But for most people whose soul could be fed and inspired by this stuff, which is what a lot of people need more than ever right now, this is not going to, it's not going to work. It's not going to cut it. So going back to what we said on our website, all of this, meaning the state of the crisis in the church, the crisis in the world, and the mode by which we're communicating these great works that created our civilization, all of this has led to the practical death of the great tradition. And the result is multiple generations, both in the church and the world, that have been orphaned from their heritage. Remember that word orphan. The resulting misery and alienation is all around us. Our civilization retains a few remnants of the old body of Christendom, but it is quickly losing its soul and with it its desire to even go on. For a civilization to go on, to survive, it has to have a reason to go on. And when you have a soul that's filled by, when it's been affected by family breakdown, civilizational breakdown, everybody being their own God, no shared values with the people around you, you basically, what's worth living for? We're seeing that the West is having a crisis of meaning, and that crisis of meaning is really ending up being a crisis of survival. The West is not going to survive if it doesn't have a meaning to survive for. So here's where we get to what is the great tradition. And here's how we explain it. Christ came into the world at the inflection point St. Paul called the fullness of time. That's from Galatians 4:4. The Jews were looking for the Messiah. The Greeks had gotten as far as unaided human reason could get through philosophy. And the Romans had pacified a barbaric world through the might of an empire spanning 3 continents. It was at this crossroads of revealed religion, philosophy, and civilization that Christ came into the world, forever uniting and fulfilling the genius of the Jews, the Greeks, and the Romans by the incarnation of the divine word, the Logos, by whom the entire universe was created and ordered. It was at this crossroads that Christendom, the civilization born from the heart of the Catholic Church, came into being. The great tradition is all that is true, good, and beautiful that preceded and proceeded from the heart of Christendom. Preceded, it came before it. Proceeded, it came forth from. It is the tradition that formed saints, sages, and statesmen. It is the law of Moses, the prophets, the scriptures, and the new covenant of Jesus Christ that fulfilled them all. It is the philosophy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and every sage in whose mind reason maintains her compass. That includes Eastern civilizations as well. It is the laws and institutions of Rome and the arts of civilization. All of these prepared the way and were indeed forever united and fulfilled by the incarnation of the Son of God. This in turn created the civilization of Christendom, from whose bosom was born saints like Athanasius, Augustine, Francis of Assisi, and Thomas Aquinas, sages like Boethius, Albert the Great, Pascal, and Hildebrand, statesmen like Justinian, King Louis IX, St. Thomas More, and Blessed Charles, and the poetry of Dante, the art of Michelangelo, and the music of Mozart, and of course, many, many more. This great tradition ennobled and redeemed the human race. It enlightened minds, inspired hearts, and liberated families, nations, and empires from thraldom to Satan. And it can do so again. So that's what we want to do. And so we want to do it in a very unique way, though. You can kind of probably see where we're going here, but I'll share, here's our vision and our mission. And again, this is directly from our website. Our vision is the preservation and revival of the great tradition for future generations by adapting it from the bare texts of former ages into the most engaging and beautiful media of our time, utilizing all the artistic and digital tools available to us in the 21st century. So that's our vision. That's what we want to see in society. Our mission, a bit more specific about what we want to do to address that, is creating a platform. And that's really important. This is ultimately about creating a platform, and I'll explain how in a bit. We want to create a platform that recruits the greatest thinkers, teachers, artists, poets, musicians, and filmmakers to preserve and revive the great tradition through the creation of the most engaging and beautiful books ever made, and integrating them with all the audio, visual, and interactive tools of the digital world. I'm going to read that one more time because every word of this has been thought through. and I think it's really important. Our mission is creating a platform that recruits the greatest thinkers, teachers, artists, poets, musicians, and filmmakers to preserve and revive the great tradition through the creation of the most engaging and beautiful books ever made, so the physical books are the core, and integrating them with all the audio, visual, and interactive tools of the digital world. So let me give an example of this. Imagine you're reading St. Augustine's Confessions or City of God, like what we were just looking at. And you have a physical book, but instead of it being completely boring, like so many of the examples we just saw, not only boring, but it's not explained. So if you're a modern reader, you don't know about this stuff, which is the vast majority of people. Again, I emphasized earlier the word orphan. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that many people these days are orphans. They have been separated from this heritage, and we need to reconnect it. We need to reconnect them with it. In that sense, it's a great spiritual work of mercy that we're asking patrons to join us with. And that spiritual work of mercy is instructing the ignorant. These are the sorts of things that fill people's souls, give them a sense of meaning, a sense of hope, a sense of purpose. It literally is, as we said on the website, it's saints, statesmen, and sages, or saints, sages, and statesmen. So saints, the great saints of the church, known for sanctity, miracles, fighting back evil, pursuing good, the most of any human beings who've ever lived. Sages would be great philosophers, great thinkers, just wise men. And then the statesmen would be great leaders of different polities, different societies. These are the works that informed these sorts of people and literally created our civilization. They aren't just intellectual curiosities that are on some shelf that we can be at leisure to either read or ignore. If we don't have this stuff, our civilization doesn't exist, okay? Those are the stakes involved. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do. And so the other important point I want to emphasize is platform. Eternal Christendom, we have got all these things we're planning to do, the 5 masterpieces as we call it, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But ultimately, this is about building a platform. And frankly, it's going to take a lot of resources, and it's going to take some time. Things that last take time. Rome was not built in a day, as the saying goes. And if you look at many of the great cathedrals, many of the great buildings of Christendom that, ironically, atheists will spend thousands and thousands on to go on vacation to go see them, they weren't built even in 1, 2, sometimes even 3 or 4 generations. Sometimes they took literally centuries. Notre Dame took several centuries. I think they're still building. I'm forgetting what it's called, but there's a cathedral in Spain that has been taken over 100 years. I think about 130, 40 years, somewhere in there, and they're still building it. It will be done in 100 or 20 or 10 to 20 years, I think. And it's getting close. But the point is that a generation of people that is eternally minded, eternal Christendom, the things that are eternally true, a generation that gets that builds like that. And what we've seen in the modern world is that we don't think like that. And therefore, all of our solutions are superficial. They don't put down deep roots, and therefore they don't last. We don't pass on much. I won't say anything because we pass on a little bit, but as we're seeing, our civilization doesn't conserve anymore. The thing that made us what we are, we're no longer conserving it. So we need a vision that is not, as I said, it's not just going to be another podcast. This podcast, I think it's going to be important. I think we're going to have some very important conversations. I'm planning to share a lot of stuff about apologetics and evangelism and the works of this great tradition to hopefully be a blessing to you and to many people to help them come into the Catholic Church. But this podcast is just the beginning. I'll explain that in a bit. But now I want to explain the logo because our mission and the thinking behind it is very much put in the logo. And you'll see in the logo in the center, we've got a cross. And up top, you'll see like a 10 Commandments with the Hebrew letters Aleph and Bet on the right and the left, because Hebrew is read from right to left. Again, we'll explain this in a little bit. Then you'll see a Parthenon, which is representing Greece. The 10 Commandments obviously represent Israel. And then the Colosseum below obviously represents Rome. And then the cross of Jesus is in the middle. And so I want to give 2 quotes from 2 church fathers, one Western and one Eastern, that kind of inspired this. One is from St. Augustine. This is from Tractate 117 on the Gospel of St. John, section 4. And both of these quotes are pondering the fact that above Christ's head on the cross, there were three languages: Jesus, King of the Jews, and it was in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So the language of Israel, the language of Greece, and the language of Rome. And so St. Augustine is commenting on this. He says, "For these three languages were conspicuous in that place, the cross, beyond all others. The Hebrew on account of the Jews who gloried in the law of God, the Greek because of the wise men among the Gentiles, and the Latin on account of the Romans who at that very time were exercising sovereign power over many and almost all countries." So St. Augustine notes this. And then another Eastern church father that noticed it, well, another church father, this time from the East, was St. Cyril of Alexandria in his commentary of Luke. And he said that the inscription declaring the crime for which the Lord was condemned clearly showed that the crucified one was king and lord of practical, natural, and theological philosophy, since the evangelist says that the inscription was written in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. I think that practical philosophy is denoted by the use of Latin, since according to Daniel, the kingdom of the Romans is stronger than any other in the world, and strength is the mark above all of practical philosophy. Natural learning I consider to be designated by the Greek language, since the Greeks studied natural philosophy more than other men. And theological teaching is denoted by the Hebrew, since the people from the beginning of its existence was clearly dedicated to God by reason of its ancestors. So that's where this comes from. So when we said earlier, Christ came in the fullness of time, what's going on in the fullness of time? As we said earlier, the Jews are looking for the Messiah. There's a lot of messianic fervor. The Greeks have gone about as far as you can get without revealed religion, meaning they'd gone as far as reason could go. Our mind is capable of discerning a lot of truths. It can discern that God is real, that he's one, that we have an eternal soul, that we will be judged in the next life for how we live this one. Things of that sort can all be known through reason. You don't need Christianity. You don't even need the law of Moses to know these things. Why do we know this? Because many great pagans came to these conclusions. Men like Plato and Aristotle and Cicero came to these and many other similar sorts of conclusions through just the mind, through the power of reason. And so that was the Greek. And then you have the Roman side, where they had pacified three continents: Europe, Africa and the Middle East, and Asia. Okay? So that created what was called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And this made it possible to travel from one end of the known world, most of it, to the other end. And this allowed the quick diffusion of the gospel once it was proclaimed forth from Jerusalem. So I read an article one time that actually mentioned, as far as the percentage of human population that has been around and what period of time it was in history it was around, up to Jesus. Do you know what the percentage of people who've ever lived so far in human history? Do you know what percentage of people were alive up to Jesus? 2%. That's it, which I was actually shocked by. So in other words, since the time that Jesus Christ, the Logos, came into the world, assumed human nature, and created the civilization called Christendom, 98% of human beings have been alive. So again, it's a remarkable thing. So that when Paul says that Christ came in the fullness of time, obviously there are going to be more human beings who live. So that 98% will get bigger and bigger and bigger, kind of asymptotically bigger. If any of you remember the asymptote from your math classes, it's that point at which, the curve will never quite hit that line, but it'll get closer and closer and closer, infinitesimally closer. That's the route that humanity is on when it comes to the percentage of human beings who have ever been alive post the coming of the Messiah. It's amazing. So the fullness of time was Israel's messianic expectations, the Greeks getting as far as the mind could get through reason alone, and the Romans pacifying three continents. And of course, that involved what we would call the arts of civilization, primarily Roman law and institutions. And so when we're talking about the great tradition and the works that formed saints, sages, and statesmen, we're not just talking about things like the church fathers, as vital as that is. We're talking about works that came from Israel beforehand, which would be primarily the Old Testament, but also works like from Philo and other Jewish works, from apocryphal writings and whatnot, And then from the Greek side, we're talking about guys like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, who is recorded by Plato, Epictetus, and a bunch of other, Demosthenes, a great Greek orator that tried to rouse Greece against the machinations of Macedonians, Philip, Alexander the Great's father, or no, it was his grandfather. But Demosthenes is a great figure. So that'd be some of the guys from the Greek side. And then from the Roman side, you've got Cicero and Livy and Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations. You've got all these great figures who, through the light of reason, are perceiving extremely important things, and they were part of creating the laws and civilization, really, but law and institutions of Rome, which pacified 3 continents, is arguably the greatest empire in the history of the world. And so that is part of this great tradition. It's not just Christian stuff. It's the stuff that God was providentially preparing. The Israelite stream, revealed religion; the Greek stream, reason and philosophy; and the Roman stream, law, civilization, institutions. And boom, Christ came into the world. And since that point in time, 98% of human beings have been alive, and the gospel from that point has gone to the ends of the earth. And so that is what is going behind our logo, and that's the thinking behind it. And what this gets at is an important point, is that I've often explained to people we're explaining Eternal Christendom to, that it's at the intersection of 3 things: apologetics, evangelism, and classical education. Classical education meaning these great works that help form saints, sages, and statesmen. We're going to have a slightly different list of books than some other places, and I'll explain that in a little bit as well. But that's essentially what Eternal Christendom is trying to do: evangelism, apologetics, and help bring back this great tradition of the classics, but in a way that so far we haven't seen done. So, for example, there is no version of the Church Fathers that is remotely like what I've described. And I'll give a kind of imagining out loud, a brainstorming session of what this could look like, just to give you an image and a sense of why we're so excited about this. The other thing is I want to point out is truth, goodness, and beauty. Those are words that are at the top of the logo, and these simply are referring to the great transcendentals of being. What does that mean? Being the highest good. God is being in himself, and all truth, all goodness, all beauty, anytime we see any of that in the creation, it's ultimately founded in God, who is truth, who is goodness, who is beauty. Okay, so that's where that comes from. And so whatever is true, whatever is good, whatever is beautiful, that's what we need to regain. So it's really that simple. And then below, you'll see the crown of victory. There's a Roman crown of victory. Paul often refers to, run the race that you may win it, to earn the prize and whatnot. So the crown of victory is that which we're all going for, so that when we depart from this life, that we truly can become saints, that we will depart from this life and we will hear, we hope, we pray, we work out our salvation in fear and trembling in order to hear these words from our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ: well done, good and faithful servant. All of life comes down to those few words that you hear upon your death, or you don't hear. That's what everything comes down to. So that crown of victory is ultimately not only the victory of individual souls, but the victory of a civilization. And then you'll also see it kind of works out with the Israel, the Greek, and the Roman thing, or maybe the opposite on the screen, the opposite direction. You'll see it's a tripartite, obviously, and so you'll see rays of light coming from behind it. This is sort of reflecting the glory of the Holy Trinity, and of course, it's centered on the cross. It's emanating from the cross, because the cross, those 3 languages above, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, united all of these things together and created what I would argue is not a perfect, but the greatest civilization that has ever existed, Christendom, and it came straight from the heart of the Catholic Church. So that's essentially what we're trying to do. And so here, I would just simply like to mention our founding patrons, Michael and Susanna Salazzo. The short version is I was making a very comfortable income after my time in the White House through various gigs and whatnot. But when I was converting, I remember, this is about in 2017, I was asking Our Lady the very first time for her prayers, and I had just kind of become barely convinced of the whole Marian stuff and being able to ask saints for their prayers. And so I said very sheepishly, I was in my room, And I looked up at the ceiling and I said, Mary, not Our Lady or Blessed Virgin or anything. I said, Mary. And I said, this was a few months into reading the Church Fathers. Things were getting really agonizing. And I knew I really wanted it resolved because it was, like I said, it was getting agonizing. So I told her, if this is your son's church, please confirm this as soon as possible. And the very next thing I said, and Jesus, if I just committed idolatry, please forgive me. And I still imagine both of them looking at each other saying that was cute. But anyway, that was the very first time, and I'll tell the story some other time, but essentially she did confirm it very quickly. And I did tell Our Lady, if this is your son's church, I will spend the rest of my life defending it. Now, I joke again. I had finished law school a few months before, so I worded it appropriately broadly so that I didn't get myself into any oaths or promises that I couldn't keep. But I essentially was in a very comfortable position as far as income and whatnot. I was, occasionally talking about church fathers and explaining my conversion through social media channels. But I remembered that promise I'd made to Our Lady, and I know that the things that God has put on my heart. And I said, I need to do that. That's what I need to spend the rest of my life doing. I know that's what he's called me to do in some form or another. And so I amicably parted ways from some of the great folks I was doing some work for. And, it allowed me to put my savings in a great position. And so my plan was to just take 3 months, 6 months, whatever, to relax, to read, to catch up on some reading I'd fallen behind on, to just take some time off. And it was at that time that my dear friend Michael Salazzo came to me. He's been a very successful guy. He was raised Catholic, went to Protestantism, and then came back to the Catholic Church. And since then, his whole family has come back. It's been really, really beautiful to watch. But Michael approached me and said, hey, I want to support you doing something related to ministry. I've felt called to do this for a while. Maybe now is the time. So that's essentially how this all started. And he brought with him our great executive director, and he's doing a lot of our development. Fundraising is Tom Huckins. And Michael brought Tom along and was like, Tom is ready to do this. He is driven by this vision as well. We want to make this possible. And so they did. They gave us a substantial gift to get us going. And so I just want to thank Michael and Susanna Salazzo from the bottom of our heart. They are the founding patrons of Eternal Christendom. And I just want to briefly thank the rest of our team as well. My producer, I won't say his name just yet, but he's doing a lot of the video editing, and he went from knowing absolutely nothing to learning all these skills to do the editing you're seeing right now. And so we're learning in the midst of this too. And then of course Tom Huckins, you'll see him, and then another one of our board members, Patrick Honeymaker. He's a very impressive guy. He was the captain of the Blue Angels, the great Air Force team, and did a lot of amazing things in the Navy and afterward. Patrick Moneymaker. And he is a great add to our team. And so there are a lot of wonderful people coming behind this vision. We also have our advisory board. I would suggest you go look at some of the names on there. And there's going to be some other very impressive names getting on that list. Basically, our advisory board is a bunch of people who are respected and have done some really wonderful things in their life and their vocation, their career, and love our vision, endorse it, are behind it, and have basically agreed to give us a bunch of free wisdom and free advice, which, Proverbs talks about, do everything you must to get wisdom. So we've got a lot of amazing Catholics who are behind this vision. So before I go to the conclusion about this podcast, I want to just paint a picture for you of what this could look like. This will take years, but we're actually doing it through something we call the 5 masterpieces. Now, the vision is so big and it will take time and resources that we're trying to be as strategic as we possibly can. So what does that mean? What it means is that we're going to start from what in our intro video we called a beachhead. I actually learned this concept from a great friend and mentor of mine who was involved with some big companies in Silicon Valley. But basically what you do is you start on a beachhead, and the beachhead you expand out from. And so if you do everything all at once, you can't do it. You don't have the resources. I don't even have a salary at this point. So you got to start small and from there go out. So that's what our first masterpiece is. It's this podcast. That's our beachhead. And the beachhead is me on this podcast. And what are we going to do in this podcast? This is point number 4 from the roadmap. This podcast will basically be 2 types of episodes. One, a monologue from me talking about some element of the Catholic faith and why I think you should be Catholic and why I think the Catholic faith is the fullness of truth. So we'll be going into a lot of stuff on the Church Fathers. Some of you, probably a lot of you, have seen my posts on X. Once I left amicably my former gigs I was doing in the hope of discerning what was next, and then Michael came to me. During that period, I decided to make how I use social media 100% about doing apologetics and evangelism. At the time on X, I was about 8,000, and as of recording this episode, we're at about almost 40,000. So I've been very humbled and surprised at how interesting the content has been to people, because I'm basically just doing long form content with all the amazing stuff I've been finding in these guys, reading these guys all the time, the Church Fathers. There's so much more to share, but it's been very powerful for many of you. And so one thing I've seen a lot, just from what people post publicly, but also a ton of private messages I get, we're getting a lot of non-Catholics, especially Protestants, who are finding the material very interesting and very thought-provoking. And many of them, for the first time in their lives, are willing to consider that they've possibly been wrong about the Catholic faith. And for the first time in their life, they're open to the possibility of becoming Catholic. The other type that we're seeing is a lot of Catholics, which is very exciting for us, because our founding patron, Michael Salazzo, he was in a situation like so many Catholics are in, where you're just not catechized well. You don't know the faith very well. That's not the universal experience of Catholics, but it's a common experience of Catholics. And so he was in that situation. And so we're finding a lot of Catholics who are getting really energized about this stuff. They're seeing connections in the Bible. They're seeing these riches in the Church Fathers. They're hearing about saints they've never heard of, and it's inspiring them to take their faith more seriously. And that's vital, because it's not how you begin as a Catholic that gets you to heaven. It's how you end. Okay, we must persevere to the end. And so that's very, very exciting. And that's exactly what our mission is meant to do. It's meant to attract people who aren't Catholics, especially Protestants. I have a particular heart for Protestants, having been myself a Protestant before, but also Catholics themselves who are, maybe they're not necessarily lukewarm, but they perhaps don't know about the glories of our civilization and Christendom. So that'll be the first type, is monologue, where we'll just talk about these sorts of things. The second type will be interview. And frankly, I'm hoping this is more often, because I think dialogues are way more interesting, generally speaking, than monologues. And I've been really, really blessed to meet a lot of extremely fascinating people. And I think they would have a lot of things that many of you would find very interesting, very thought-provoking. Maybe some of you wouldn't agree with everything I say, but that's okay. That's okay. We're here. Finding the truth is hard, and following it is even harder. So I'm planning to interview people who have tried to do that in their lives, mostly converts to the Catholic faith. And we're going to talk about their story. We're going to talk about the truths that they found in the church, why they became Catholic, why they believe you should become Catholic, and also about people who are experts on a lot of this great tradition stuff, who are maybe experts on Plato or Aristotle or St. Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or St. Athanasius or other church fathers, who can dive deeply into this stuff. Basically, I want to do this podcast in a way that I've tried to do writing. It's not always possible, because we're fallible human beings, but I basically want every episode to be perennial, to be evergreen. If the digital servers that this podcast are on exist in 100 years, I want what these podcasts say to be valuable and edifying 100 years from now or 200 years from now. That's the kind of content we're hoping to produce for all of you. And so that's, like I said at the beginning, there are plenty of podcasts in the world. So why on earth are we doing this one? Well, again, I think for this vision is very different than a lot of what's out there already. I think there are some apostolates that are doing aspects of this, but I think we're bringing together a number of threads I think will be very, very valuable. And frankly, as I said with our mission and our vision, we want to create a platform, and that platform will help put out a lot of great material from other apostolates. We're all on the same team. We want other people to come into the Catholic Church to experience the glories of Christendom. And so we're going to be looking to team up with as many different great apostolates as possible. while focusing like hawks on digging deep on the sorts of things that we're talking about here. Now, I would summarize all this, like, why this podcast? Well, I think we need apologetics and evangelism at a deep, a beautiful, and a civilizational level. Deep, I think, is obvious. We want to go deeper than just, typing in church father quotes Eucharist. That's not deep, okay? And actually, you'll find a lot of false stuff and decontextualized stuff. The experience of reading the Fathers is so much different when you open it and you read from the beginning of a work all the way to an end. It's very different, much richer. So we want to go deep. Beautiful. This is key. We want to do everything at as high a level as possible. I remember my first time I went to Rome and I was in the Vatican. It was 2007, so I would have been 19. Yeah, I would have been 19 years old in 2007. And I remember visiting the Vatican, and I had a classical music education, and so I had done a lot of reading up to that point, just kind of on my own. And so there were so many things in the Vatican that I knew what they were references to. Not everything, but a lot. So I was like, wow, this is so beautiful. But then I was remembering, well, this is the Catholic Church, and we left them, and they're quasi-pagan apostates. So it was like I had this split heart when I was in the Vatican for the first time, like, oh, this is so beautiful, but I hate it. But what I've come to realize, and I think many converts have experienced this as well in this age and former ages, beauty is a hook of the soul. And I do think, especially when you're in a time of crisis, when people are traumatized by many things going on in the world, a logical argument, as important as it is, you present all your evidence, you present the arguments, that's extremely important. We're rational animals. Our highest faculty is rationality, right? So I'm not downplaying that whatsoever. But we also know that we're damaged. We have original sin, and if we've been baptized, the original sin's off, but we have concupiscence, so we struggle against the flesh, and that struggle against the flesh only gets harder the more hits you take in life. Through God's grace, through Christ's grace, I think it can actually be a source of great life and edification and growing in holiness, so we can actually get better through our suffering. But the vast majority of human beings in this world, the more we get hit in life, the more traumatized and sort of, injured and damaged we become. And so beauty is a way to poke through that and to reach a soul in a way that maybe arguments and logic won't always do. And so that doesn't mean we do away with argument and logic. It just means that we've got to do apologetics and evangelism in the way that the church has so often done throughout the ages. Those cathedrals with the stained glass windows and the statues, all of that was meant to be catechesis for peasants who didn't know how to read, okay? Much of the greatest music that we continue to love to this day was either created by Catholics for the Mass or things related to it, or created by composers who, in the case of someone like Verdi, his Requiem, he was an atheist. He was an atheist. But if you listen to his Requiem, it's one of the most powerful pieces of music ever written. And it was directly inspired by the Latin Mass of the Roman Church. This is how the church has done evangelism for so many centuries. And I think there are some great apostolates who are starting to regain this. Well, we want to fully regain it, and we want to apply it to all of this stuff, all the great tradition that came before us, and we want to pass on, because we know that beauty and visuals matter in every generation, but they matter more than ever in this generation. Why? Because of these things, because of these devices, because of the constant 24/7 digital, visual, electronic environment that we're in. That is something unprecedented. We know that to do effective evangelism and apologetics, we need to meet people where they are. Now, like Christ with us, we don't meet them where they are and stay there with them. We want to raise them up and point them to God, right? But the fact is that unless we reach them where they are, which is cultural orphans and completely enmeshed in this digital, electronic, and visual society, we're not going to reach them. So beauty is absolutely vital to this. And the fact is there are so many tools available in the 21st century, digital tools, electronic tools, internet tools, all sorts of things. There's so many artists out there these days. And And there's so many concepts. I mean, I could give so many examples. I could just ramble. You could probably tell that. I can do that sometimes. But there's so many concepts that could be explained apologetically through amazing charts and illustrations and art. I have so many ideas in my head. I know other artists who do too, but it just hasn't been done. And so we have more opportunities today than we've ever had before. And unless we take those opportunities and apply it to apologetics, we are going to lose opportunities for getting more converts to the Catholic faith and to Jesus Christ and his church. So deep, beautiful, and civilizational. What I mean by civilizational is becoming a Christian. It is about you and God. It is about ultimately your eternal salvation, you as an individual soul, me as an individual soul. But it's so much bigger than that. And I think this was a big angle of my becoming Catholic from Protestant. It's not just me, it's us. It's not just you, it's us. We're part of an organism, the body of Christ, the mystical body of Christ. St. Paul says we're members one of another. That's very intimate, very deep language. And this union of Christ with the church, which Paul describes in Ephesians 5 as like a marriage between a bridegroom and a bride, this intimacy has created a great civilization. Now, for those of us in the church on earth, we're still struggling through sin. It's kind of like the children of Israel. They're going through their 40 years in the desert. God was creating something beautiful with them as well. But they had their 40 years of trial and travail and external enemies attacking and internal enemies undermining from within. So all this beauty and this great civilization, it doesn't mean that there aren't bad things. And we'll have a lot of episodes about that because there's a lot of deep biblical typology here that a lot of fathers have unpacked as well. But so what I mean by civilizational and it's not just me or you, but it's us, is it's a story. History is God's story. And I think what is sometimes missed in apologetics and evangelism these days, especially apologetics, there's so many amazing ones out there, amazing apologists out there. But I think what we need to recover is a sense of story in apologetics. There are countless examples of this, but I'll give just one. One of the really amazing and kind of cool things I've discovered in the Church Fathers, there's all these incredible stories about how priests were fighting the demonic. I had never heard about that kind of stuff. But basically, when Christ comes into the world is ruled by paganism. And Christ in the gospel, through the power of the priesthood in the Catholic Church, starts going forth. And so there's all these very real, by real, I mean, visual. People are seeing this. They're hearing it. Battles with the demonic. There are demons producing false miracles and pagan priests who are doing battle with Catholic priests. And there's one story from St. John Chrysostom about relics. I used to think venerating relics was a deeply pagan thing. I read the Church Fathers like, no, it's the exact opposite. The people who hated venerating relics the most were pagans. But there's all these stories about St. John Chrysostom gives one about St. Babylas, the relics of St. Babylas, who was a bishop in the East. But there's many similar stories, basically, of these relics driving away demonic powers. Julian the Apostate, in the story that John Chrysostom cites, he was a pagan Roman emperor. He was raised Christian, but then when he became emperor for about 3 years, I think, he tore off the mask and he tried to restore paganism after several decades of the emperors basically closing the temples and bringing paganism to an end. But he was trying to revive it, and he was going to consult an oracle of Apollo, not the one at Delphi, which is a kind of famous one in Greece, but one in a more eastern city, I think in the kind of Syria, I'm forgetting where it was, but Syria, Turkey area. So he goes to consult this oracle. So he's trying to talk with a demon, okay? But the demon tells him, there are these dead bodies nearby. He didn't want to admit that it was the saint, a Catholic saint, that was keeping him from, talking to Julian. But he was basically, there's these dead bodies and you need to remove them and whatnot for me to be able to give you, Julian was trying to figure out something about the future. And, a demon was falsely offering him that. So anyway, Julian removes these dead bodies, among them being, or he tries to at least, among them being the relics of St. Babylas. But as they're trying to do that, lightning strikes the pagan temple of the oracle, and it's destroyed. So there are so many amazing stories like that. There's countless others. And just the way the fathers unpack the Catholic story, they're constantly pointing to what's happening around them for Jews and for pagans and for heretics. Like, look around you. The pagan altars are falling. The altars to Christ and the sacrifice of the Eucharist is replacing all the demonic sacrifices to false gods. And they're saying this was prophesied in the Old Testament, and you see Christ promising it here in the New Testament. So my point is there's this grander story that the fathers are constantly telling us. And I think there are ways we must do that with apologetics and evangelism in order to reach people, especially now. It's so interesting to me. I've never really been tempted by atheism, but one of the things that's really struck me as a point against atheism is if we're really just matter and motion, why do we human beings care about things like beauty? Why do we care about things like music? And when it comes to this civilizational, this story-based approach to things, why do we care about stories? The human beings are story-consuming creatures. We love a good story. Isn't that fascinating? I don't know why. Maybe you're not as enraptured by this, but I am utterly astounded by this propensity of human beings to love stories. And I think we need to tap into that when it comes to apologetics and evangelism. That's behind everything we're doing, because we need to tell the story of Christendom and how the incarnation essentially radically altered the destiny of not just individual human beings, but the world. We need to tell that story. And all that to say, when it comes to Protestants in particular, I don't give a damn about owning Protestants. Nobody should. Many of my dearest friends and mentors are Protestants. I do want them to become Catholic, because I do think Protestantism is a false religion. It's not from God. It has important elements from truth that are from God, but it's a false religion insofar as it's departed from the Catholic faith. I want Protestants to realize that this is their heritage too. I want atheists who perhaps go on vacation to Notre Dame or to the Vatican or to Mont Saint-Michel. They go on vacation to these places, but they don't believe that which created those things. I want them to realize that this is their heritage as well. So much of what's going on in our civilization right now, I believe, is a result of us not knowing our story, not knowing where we come from, and not passing it on. If you don't know where you've come from, you can't pass it on to future generations. But we human beings, we thrive on not only stories, but knowing where we fit in that story. The best stories are things that you can see yourself in. And whether you like it or not, every single one of us is in a story. That story is being written by God. And God, at his core, is love. And he calls us, because he is love, he calls us to communion with himself. And that, he said, one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible, Paul says, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can conceive the things that God has prepared for those who love him. And that's what all of this is about, bringing all this back to the great tradition. And I'll close with this. I've probably said that a few times, but I actually will close with this. I want you to imagine a book of St. Augustine's, like City of God. And imagine it's full of illuminated manuscripts. Every page is gorgeous. It's full of beautiful art showing things, maybe events that Augustine's referring to. It's got all these explanations of the historical events in the background that St. Augustine's referring to. And then on each chapter, it's got a QR code, and you can QR code that. And it opens a whole digital world of resources where you can connect with a Scott Hahn video or a Catholic Answers video or a Brant Petrie thing or a great lecture from a great scholar on this art or something in St. Augustine. Or we go on site at some of these places and we show people around the places that St. Augustine is talking about. In other words, you make the text come alive in a way that modern people can understand and can relate to. It's visual, it's digital and electronic, but it begins with the physical book and it grows into this literally limitless digital world. So we want to literally create this this genre, really, of integrated books, where it's the physical book, but you have it's completely digitally integrated as well. And through that digital part, since you're physically limited to what you can do with books, you can add on whatever you want. We can constantly improve. We can constantly add content. Imagine if for that book by St. Augustine, whether it's City of God or Confessions, for that book, there's a Hollywood level trailer about it. What is a trailer meant to do? It's meant to get you interested to go see a movie. We spend millions and millions and millions of dollars to create trash movies and trailers to go get people to watch them. I think it's about time that we as Catholics, we as Christians, invest that amount of time, that amount of money to show people the story of Christendom and why they need to become Catholic. Because to become Catholic is to be at the center of God's story for humanity and to be at the center of God's story for you as well. And so that's what we need to do. Professors, poets, artists, filmmakers, musicians, all of them need to be brought to bear to bring this stuff and more alive in a way it's never been brought alive before. And frankly, this is going to take a new era of patronage. Many of the greatest works that were created in Christendom's history, the Statue of David or the works of Mozart or the works of Dante or whatever it was, there's a million examples. The vast majority of them were created by something called patronage. And what is patronage? Patronage is essentially people with big checkbooks who basically tell the people who are creating it, do it at the highest possible level. Now, what's the benefit of that? The benefit of that is that instead of being driven by purely market forces where you have to make a profit, which usually has to be done short term, there's many good things about the profit motive, but one of the really bad side effects is it tends to inculcate short-term thinking, okay? Eternal Christendom is about long-term thinking, and patronage is about long-term thinking. It's about creating works that long outlast those who created them, okay? Again, we go to the cathedrals hundreds of years later. We listen to Mozart hundreds of years later. We read Dante almost 1,000 years later, okay? And many of the fathers. These are the things that patronage helps create. So we definitely need the support of all of you. We make it possible to give one-time patronage or monthly patronage. We're trying to build our monthly patronage base. We're going to be doing that in the coming months and years so that we can at least cover our overhead costs. These things do take money. But we're trying to do something it's so much beyond this podcast. But the podcast is just the beginning. But it takes time and resources. But we're calling on a new era of patronage to make this happen, and especially wealthy Catholics. One of the things in the political world I was so upset by was so much money has been spent on all these short-term political endeavors, elections and whatnot. But what's been the result? I think there's been some good fruits here and there. But overall, if you took a fraction of the money that has been spent on political campaigns, and you applied it to things like this, who knows what we could create? And when you enable the people who have the talents, all of us have been given different talents. Our founding patrons, Michael and Susanna, one of Michael's talents, he's good at making money. That's just one of the things he's good at. He's good at many things. He's not as good at reading the Fathers like I am. That's something I'm talented in. And so when we get the people with the right talents and you put them together and you give them the resources to create something true, to create something beautiful, good and beautiful, it's amazing what can be accomplished. And literally everything we still love centuries, millennia later, it was all created that way. So I'll say, I keep saying finally, I need to stop doing that. I'll say that the way we're doing this, we're starting with this podcast. The next thing we're going to do, the masterpiece number 2, is audio. Audio will basically be, imagine all the church fathers, all these great classics in well-done professional audio. Now, there's some of it out there already, but not much. But audio, long-form audio is key to the world today. How many times do people listen to 3-hour Joe Rogan podcasts or whatever? Now, what if you could do that with the writings of the church fathers? Imagine you're reading Augustine, and you do your QR code, and you are able to open the Eternal Christendom app, and it opens up to the audio version so that when you're driving to work, you can keep listening to the very part of St. Augustine you were listening to. So we actually have some great people we're lining up now, British people. We Americans fall for British accents all the time. We're going to be having people produce some audio in the short term. We're going to hopefully show all of you some samples of what we're hoping to do. We're going to start with the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch. I've already been updating through some patristic scholars who translate. We've already been updating the translations, and have a wonderful member of our advisory board. I'll go into it later, but a British man who has very generously offered to help us produce some of these samples. So we'll be showing that to you more in the future. But we've got the podcast, then we've got audio. So imagine everything in audio. The next thing is Eternal Christendom Classics. That's masterpiece number 3. That will be basically all these books, the physical books that we've been talking about in the Great Tradition. Then the next one is masterpiece number 4, Eternal Christendom Bible. This will basically be we want it to be the preeminent apologetics Bible out there. So if you have somebody in your family who is non-Catholic, but you think they're open to the Catholic faith, especially if they're from a Protestant or other Christian tradition that's not Catholic, that we want this to be the go-to Bible that basically shows that the Bible is a Catholic book entrusted to the Catholic Church, and it teaches the Catholic faith. And there's a million ways to do that through church father quotes and stories, and you make it beautiful with illuminated manuscripts, and you provide great artwork, and that's not even getting into connecting it to the whole digital world through the app. And that gets to the final masterpiece number 5, which we're calling the Digital Cathedral. And as I'm sure all of you know, a cathedral is meant to induce awe at God through beauty and a sort of sense of the numinous, the mysterious. And so obviously a digital app can't do that at quite the level a cathedral can, but we want to do what we can on the digital level so that as these books are created and you've got your QR codes, they connect you to a limitless world of digital content, the trailers, the audio, great lectures and whatnot, podcast episodes, just a million. This is where the platform element comes in. The Digital Cathedral will be the platform. We are not here to compete with other great apostolates. We're here to augment their great work and to be a place where more people than ever can connect with them as well. We're on the same team. We want to win souls for Jesus Christ in the church. So anyway, this has gone a bit longer than I thought it would, but this is what this prologue was about, is essentially explaining a bit of my background, a bit of our background, what was behind this vision, and what we plan to do. So again, truth, beauty, and goodness of the great tradition. The great tradition that forms saints, sages, and statesmen literally formed our civilization. Without it, without this stuff, you don't have a civilization. We have a cultural orphans that are all over the world now, and we are asking you to help us, especially if you're a wealthy Catholic who God has entrusted with resources that you will have to render an account, all of us will, for how we use the gifts he gave us. We're asking all of you, and especially wealthy Catholics, to join us as patrons, to help us do this great spiritual work of mercy, to give back to this culture of orphans, their heritage. And, we have a lot of things to figure out about how we're going to do that. We know that there are real costs involved, and but our heart at Eternal Christendom is to give as much of this stuff away as we possibly can, for free, at least for those who genuinely can't afford it. We do not want socioeconomic background to be a hindrance to people accessing this beauty. The thing about cathedrals is they were oftentimes the greatest and most beautiful thing that an average peasant would have known in their entire life, okay? Most people today, unless we engage in this great and beneficent act of mercy and love for them, they will not find this stuff. They won't have the resources to get it. We're asking you to partner with us as patrons, a new era of patronage, to help us provide this. So it's so much bigger than this podcast, but we start with the podcast. We're going to do audio for all of these great works of the great tradition. We're going to do the new golden standard set of the classics that are the most beautiful and engaging set of books ever made. We're going to do that with the Bible, and we're finally going to make sure that the physical medium of books and the digital world of the internet are brought together in a way that helps as many people as possible discover the truth, goodness, and beauty of the Catholic faith through the Digital Cathedral. And if this is a vision that you find compelling, if this is a vision you think would help you and would help the people you love to come encounter Christ in the church, please become a patron. Please support us. And with that, may the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May he shine his countenance upon you and give you peace. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon.